Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. Until YouTube vaporizes it, that is. But while we quiver in anticipation for that event, the time has come. As the Walrus said, this is where I actually make good on my promise, gang, that I made in my last On the Stone video. And this is where I give some, what I think is some hard, actual practical advice as to where we go from here. Now, before we get going and we actually dive into the meat and potatoes of this video, I need to make two quick caveats. Caveat number one, this is not by far, by any stretch of the imagination, a comprehensive list. This is at best a very, very rough outline as to what I think we need to start doing in order to begin gestating the next revolution, which I remain convinced is what we actually have to do if we want to save our homeland and actually save our civilization. So, this is not the end all and be all by any stretch of the imagination. So if any of you guys have any other ideas, opinions, suggestions, please, by all means, let us know in the comment box below. Caveat number two, this video is not being sponsored by any person, institution, what have you. I'm going to be listing a lot of resources here, so I wanted to make that perfectly clear. And speaking of resources, I am not just going to be giving generic advice. Oh, we need to do X in order to achieve Y. How do we do X, Nate? Well, I don't know. You figure it out. I'm actually going to be giving some actual advice. That's the best way that I can describe it, gang. I'm actually going to be listing some concrete steps in some specific categories, which I think we need to start doing. And I will actually, in the description box below, I will actually provide links to some of these resources. So in case a book title or a resource catches your eye and you want to investigate further, you're not going to have to go through who knows how many Google searches in order to try and find it. It's going to be right there in the description box. Just trying to make it as easy as I can for all of you guys. So, with those two bits of business out of the way, let us proceed. Now, the first thing that I think we have to do can be boiled down to one word, and that is education. Now, before people leave, get up, click out of the video in disappointment or disgust, again, let me be very clear. I am not saying that we simply need to agitate for school choice. You know, school choice, I love school choice. And school choice was a great goal to have maybe 30 years or so ago, but the times have moved on, and we cannot simply fight so that parents have the option to pull their kids out of the public indoctrination centers or not. In fact, I don't even think that school choice, as the contemporary American right is fighting it, does any good at all, because right now, people are saying, oh yeah, parents should absolutely be given the choice of where they send their kids to school. I absolutely agree. But then there is absolutely no plan for actually getting the biggest number of parents to pull their kids out of the public school system, such as maybe providing financial assistance to families who would like to get their kids out of the cesspool that is the public school in their district, but actually lack the cash to make that dream a reality. And even on top of that, there's still not a lot of incentive to send your kids to private school, I don't think. To give just one example, there is a 7.3 point difference in the reading levels between kids who go to private school and kids who go to public schools. And that seems like a really big difference, right? And it is. Let's be absolutely fair about it. But that statistic, that difference, loses a bit of its bite when you remember that the overall reading proficiency rate for 8th graders in the public school system is 35%. So 35% versus 42.3% proficiency rate in reading, not exactly something to write home about. What I maintained before and what I maintain again today is that the entire public education system has to be destroyed. It has to be toppled down, crushed, decimated, burned, and then the ground upon which it stood has to be sown with salt. And the best way to do that, I believe, is to actually start educating ourselves. We need to start educating ourselves, and then if we have kids, we need to start educating them too, even if it's above and beyond what they're already doing in the public school education system, because I know that, again, not everyone is going to be able to take their kids out of the public indoctrination system, at least not immediately. So this is something that we have to do in the meantime for our kids, and if we don't have kids, or if the kids are grown up, this is something that we have to start doing for ourselves, for our own benefits. Now, the reason for that, why we actually have to restart the entire education system, is because for the longest time, we've had the completely wrong idea about education, gang. We've thought that education was a purely utilitarian tool. We went through, mostly now, preschool and kindergarten so that we could go through grade school. We went through grade school so that we could go to high school. We had to do well in high school and get a diploma so that we could get into a college. And we had to get into college and graduate after 4 years so that we could put it on a resume so that someone way out there, somewhere behind a desk, might read our application and give us a job after we graduated. So then we can turn around and pay off the massive debt that we accumulated to actually get to that point. It's a very dehumanizing way to look at education. What education really is, it's a tool, yes, not to get a job, not to make us quote unquote useful in the economy, which again is a good thing. But the purpose of education is to actually make us more human. I mean, think about it, gang. If we are rational substances, if our ability to reason, if our rational nature is what separates us from every other thing on this world, then it just makes sense that actually nourishing our ability to reason, feeding it, strengthening it, exercising it, building upon it, growing it, will allow us to actually reach our full potential as Homo sapiens. Now, again, I have to say, you might be thinking at this point, Nate, what is even the purpose, though, of education? I mean, look at the debt, look at the economy, look at the transgender ideology, look at the southern border. What is education going to do in regards to any of this? I mean, how is this going to make a difference? Sell this to us. Well, the best selling point, I think, besides the one I already gave, that it will actually allow us to fully realize our potential as human beings, is that the first American Revolution, gang, largely succeeded because the American population of the 18th century was so well educated. Now, this is a fact that has actually, unfortunately, been largely lost in contemporary history, but it is a fact. For example, there were 4 times as many newspapers in the 13 American colonies in the 18th century than there were in France at the same time, even though France had 6 times the population as the American colonies, and France was seen as being the #1 educated country in Europe in the 18th century. If you wanted to get an education, you went to a French university. And these newspapers, these dozens of newspapers, they were put into taverns, they were put into inns, and everybody would come and read them. People actually read them. People were actually educated. And then they would talk about them in said inns, in said taverns. They would gather together in the shops and in the public square, and they would talk about the news stories that they had read. Local news and largely international news. A lot of news was brought in. And so this is how they knew what was going on in the wider world. And this actually had practical effects. There are stories and accounts that French officers during the American Revolution who didn't speak a word of English were able to communicate with common American soldiers who couldn't speak a word of French, because the French officers and the American soldiers could both speak Latin, or at least they knew enough Latin that they could actually talk to each other. It was really, really neat. Give you another example. In March of 1781, to commemorate the 11th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, which was March 5th of 1770, we just passed that anniversary, Thomas Dawes Jr. was elected to give the commemorative address. And he gave a very learned and a very detailed, i.e. long, history lesson about Republican governments, how they had started, their history, etc., starting in ancient Greece, Rome, etc. And in that speech, which he gave in Boston to just a group of regular, ordinary people, this was not a speech or a lecture given to a bunch of intellectuals in New England or even the Boston intelligentsia. This was just common, everyday men and women. Thomas Dawes Jr., in his speech, quoted Marcus Aurelius, Ovid, Pope, Seneca, Newton, Blair, Juvenal, Addison, Blackstone, and the Bible. Which means that not only was he familiar with all of these sources and all of these writers, but he expected his audience to be knowledgeable about them as well. That's the thing. He expected, when he quoted Marcus Aurelius, even if he didn't cite Aurelius, he expected his audience to know, oh, he just quoted Marcus Aurelius. And I think that John Adams said it best, because of course John Adams would, as usual. John Adams said it best when he wrote many, many years after the American Revolution. And someone asked him a very philosophical question. They asked him, what was the American Revolution? And John Adams responded thus: but what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. And it was in the minds and hearts of the people because they were educated. They were therefore able to read the arguments for revolution. They were able to give their assent to those arguments, and then they were able to articulate those arguments again, or they were so convinced by those arguments that they put their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor on the line to fight for that cause. Don't forget, the vast majority of common, ordinary Americans came to support the idea of revolution after reading Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in 1776. It was by reading, discussing, and digesting Paine's arguments that the cause for revolution really kind of seeped down and took a life of its own in the colonies. A new and invigorated education system is going to have to cover a number of different fields, gang. It just is. But today I want to focus particularly on history and philosophy. First, because those two are areas that I know a little bit more about, and because I know that you guys don't want to sit through a 90-minute video where I list sources for every single area of education. Now, history is a no-brainer because without history, we really lose a big chunk of ourselves. We lose a big part of our identity, naturally, because if we forget from who and from where we came, we're not going to have nearly as clear an idea as we need as to who we are today. But the problem is that decades and decades and decades of propaganda at those public schools that I mentioned before at the beginning, they really have made it so that we have to start from scratch. It's not enough to just start relearning and re-educating ourselves about the history of our own country. We have to know the history of our entire flippin' civilization. Now, fortunately, there are some resources to help us do this. Hillsdale College is one of the best private colleges in the United States. In fact, it's one of the best colleges just in general in the country today. First, because they have a great grade A faculty. That said faculty and that student body actually has a genuine love for the truth. They're not there to make political points. They're not there just to experience college life. They're not there because of the great new student bar or student nightclub or anything like that. They actually want to learn. They want to engage in the great thoughts, and they want to pursue the truth. And thirdly, Hillsdale doesn't take a dime of federal government money, meaning that it can ignore all the dictates from Washington, D.C. when it comes to education. Now, the faculty and the administration at Hillsdale, they know perfectly well that not everyone is going to be able to actually attend their classes. So for the past several years, the faculty and the administration at Hillsdale has been working to bring Hillsdale to all of us. So that now Hillsdale College actually offers several online courses taught by Hillsdale's own professors. So you're not getting cheated. They're not just slides or anything like that. These are actual videotaped, recorded, I should say. They are actual recorded lectures by Hillsdale's own professors. And the best part, gang, is that these are 100% free. Now, you didn't mishear me. They are free. F-R-E-E. You go to Hillsdale's website, you create an account. I think you have to create a username, and you have to give them your email address, and then that's basically it. And the best part, even about that game, because there's even a better part than the fact that these courses are free. The best part is that there's no time limit after you've signed up for a particular class. No time limit at all. Once you sign into a class, you don't have to have all the lectures listened to by the end of the week or at the end of 2 weeks, and then you'll be locked out forever, and if you only got a third of the way through, well, sorry, tough toenails. You can take as much time as you need to go through these lectures, meaning that you can fit them into your schedule, whatever your schedule looks like. And there are 3 in particular that I wanted to bring to your attention today. The first one is the 101 Western Heritage course, which is sort of a broad overview of the history of Western civilization. Again, like I said, we need to start relearning our history going all the way back there. There is a class on the history of Athens and Sparta in particular, very important, since Athens and Sparta were sort of the birthplaces of democracy and a whole lot of Greek culture, which again is one of the pillars of Western civilization, happened in Sparta, Athens, or in the interaction between those two city-states. And then there is the American Heritage class. All of them highly recommended. However, we can't just leave it there, and so I have some other suggestions for you. If you actually want to dive into the American Revolution itself, then the 2 books that I would recommend off the top of my head are Edmund Morgan's American Revolution and David McCullough's 1776. They are very easy to read. Morgan was an academic, but he doesn't write like an academic. McCullough is not an academic at all, but he does his research. He has endnotes upon endnotes upon endnotes of the primary sources that he has looked at, that he has read, so you know that you're actually getting an authentic picture as to what was happening and who did what and who said what when. Now, that's more for the American Revolution, sort of on the fighting side. If you're looking for more of the political angle of it all, then I would suggest 2 books by a man named Gordon Wood, who is one of the preeminent American historians alive today. And they would be The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, and Empire of Liberty, 1787 to 1815. Those 2 are sort of bookends. Empire of Liberty being sort of a spiritual sequel to The Creation of the American Republic. But if you find like you already know the politics of it, sort of the arguments of the revolution and the fighting and the battles, and you actually want to know more about the characters, then Edmund Morgan, the characters, the men and women who actually lived, breathed, and brought about the revolution, they brought it forth, gave it birth from their minds into the actual real world, then Edmund Morgan, again, has a great book called Revolutionary Characters, which is really a collection of mini biographies, almost, of some of the principal people who participated in the American Revolution. Aside from that, if you want another book that I would recommend, two of them actually, come from another historian who is sadly no longer with us, but his name is Forrest McDonald. And he wrote a book I would recommend called Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is about the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, the forming of the Constitution. And he also wrote a book called State Rights and the Union, in which he examines the tension between the federal government and the individual states from 1776 to 1876. And aside from that, I would also recommend this book right here by Thomas G. West called Vindicating the Founders, Race, Sex, Class, and Justice in the Origins of America. And this is a fantastic book. It's not very long at all. It's less than 200 pages if you don't count the bibliography and the endnotes. But what he does is he actually takes a particular aspect of colonial society or an aspect of reality that was present during the Revolution and the founding of the United States. So, for example, slavery. And he actually goes through a lot of what we would call just what we take for general knowledge today about slavery in America. And the left, of course, as we know, gang, with the 1619 Project, has been all over slavery, about how this means that the entire American experiment has not only been doomed to failure, but has been evil from the very beginning. West does that with slavery. He actually looks at these arguments and these claims, and he actually, he just bursts them all. Not just with slavery, but he also has chapters on property rights, women in the right to vote, women in the family, etc. It's a great resource. Highly recommended. And as you will notice here, it has a blurb by the other historian I just mentioned, Forrest McDonald. So you know you can't go wrong. And if you happen to be a history nerd like I am, and all these secondary sources are fine and dandy, but you actually want to dive deeper into what the people themselves were actually saying, if you want to go into the primary sources, okay, you've left the meadows of secondary sources and now you want to forage in the forest of the primary sources, then this is the guide for you. American Political Writing During the Founding Era, 1760 to 1805. This comes in 2 volumes. This is a fantastic source. Has sources from the 1760s to when disagreements with England first began, all the way to the early 19th century, to the election, the presidential election of 1800 and the Jeffersonian Revolution. There are pieces here, there are writing samples here from, of course, men that we all know, like John Adams and Benjamin Rush, but there are also writings from people that have been sadly neglected by history, overshadowed, we might say. John Tucker, for example, an election sermon given in Boston in 1771. One of my favorites here is On the Right to Rebel Against Governors, which was another sermon which was given in 1776 by the Reverend Samuel West. There is writings by Amos Fisher, James Wilson. This is a great resource as well. And if you want more primary sources, gang, or if, again, this book might be a little expensive, and again, it's 2 volumes, there is another source, again, I will link this all down below in the description box, called Online Library of Liberty, where you can actually purchase books such as a collection of writings of George Washington, the collected revolutionary writings of John Adams, a 2-volume work on the writings of James Wilson, okay, which are actually pretty economically priced. I would highly recommend that you look at those as well. Staying in the same realm of history, gang, I also have to say that the ancient Roman writers, people like Cicero, who was the last defender of the Roman Republic, Tacitus the historian, Virgil the poet, Plutarch the biographer, we need to start dusting them off, and we need to start reading them again as well. Now, and I'm sure you're asking quite legitimately too, why would we do that? That seems pretty esoteric, but there is a reason why I'm including them, gang. And the reason is because our American forefathers, the men and the women who promulgated, fought, fanned, lived and breathed and died the American Revolution, they devoured the works of these ancient Romans because they saw the Roman Republic as being an apex in human history where ordered liberty had reigned supreme. And it had reigned supreme, not coincidentally, because the Romans had been a virtuous people. They had been courageous, they had been honorable, they had been industrious, they had been frugal, and they had just been what we would call today salt of the earth people. Pagans, yes, but they were salt of the earth people. And in fact, Americans of the 18th century consciously tried to emulate the Romans and the Roman Republic. So, for example, John Adams, when he was sent by Congress to France for the first time in 1778 as ambassador, one aristocratic French woman described Adams as being a true Roman, meaning that his character was that of an old Roman Republican in his virtue, his sense of honor, duty, and his public spiritedness. Many French soldiers, again, they described common American soldiers as being Romans, especially in the way that they shouldered and marched on through adversity, pain, and suffering. I mean, just think of the winter of Valley Forge, the winter of 1777, 1778. And then George Washington, I love this story. George Washington, one of his favorite plays was a play called Cato. It was written by a man named Joseph Addison in 1713. And the play Cato dramatized the life of Marcus Cato, who was a Roman Republican who fought to the bitter end against the ever-growing and accumulating power of Julius Caesar. The real Cato and the Cato in the play both actually commit suicide at the end when he knows that his efforts to save the Roman Republic have failed. And because of this, because he would rather die with his republic than actually live under a tyranny, a despotism, is why Cato became revered as sort of a Republican martyr, a man of principle and virtue, who would rather have died, rather than to live as a slave. And these things, the writings of these men, seeing their lives brought back to life again on the stage, it impacted Americans at the time much more than we can ever really imagine. We would have had to be there to actually understand fully how much Americans of the 18th century admired the ancient Romans and how much they actually wanted to be like the Romans again. And in fact, little aside here, if you're looking for a book about how all the ways that the Americans of the 18th century, of the Revolution and the founding and the framing, actually consciously try to emulate themselves and the society and the country that they were creating on Rome, then you need to read Aaron Shalev's book, Rome Reborn on Western Shores. Now, warning here, Shalev is an academic, and so he does write more like an academic. It's a bit more technical, it's a bit more dry, but it's an utterly fascinating work on a facet of history that has not received nearly as much attention as it should. Unfortunately, gang, as much as I love history, I know that we cannot stay indefinitely within that realm, because philosophy is also just as important as history. And in fact, in a time when common sense, clear, logical thinking, and just a basic understanding of fundamental philosophical principles is probably at an all-time low, even among professional philosophers, we really need to rekindle that flame which was first recorded in ancient Athens with the arrival of a guy named Socrates. I know that the pre-Socratics were there before Socrates, but everyone always says that Socrates was the first actual real philosopher, and so I shall not argue with that point here. Now, when it comes to philosophy, I have three resources to give to you. The first one is a man named Mortimer Adler, 20th century Aristotelian philosopher who wrote books like 10 Philosophical Mistakes. He also wrote another book that I would recommend called Aristotle for Everybody. 10 Philosophical Mistakes looks at, just like the title implies, 10 philosophical mistakes that range from consciousness, intellect and sense, moral values, freedom of choice, human nature, human society, human existence. And then it actually breaks down what the mistakes are, why they're mistakes, and he points to the correct understanding of those topics. And in Aristotle for Everybody, Adler really knocks one out of the ballpark because he condenses a lot of Aristotle's work in multiple fields, metaphysics, ethics, politics, into one book. And the best thing about Adler is that even though he was an academic, he was a professional philosopher, he does not write in academic jargon. He writes for everyday, ordinary people like you and I. He's not writing for professional historians. He's not trying to preen his feathers before his peers in the realm of academic philosophers. He's actually trying to help people to think more deeply and better about important things. That is the first one. The second resource that I have is Edward Fazer, who is a philosopher who is still with us. He is an Aristotelian Thomist. I would especially recommend his book, The Last Superstition, which was written specifically to take apart the arguments of a group that came about in the early 2000s called the New Atheists. People like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens were two prominent names. Richard Dawkins was another one. But even though Fazer's book, The Last Superstition, is addressed primarily to the New Atheists, anyone can read it, okay? It is not so focused on that end goal that is the only reason why you would read it. Because reading Fazer's book, you, for example, learn about the four causes, the material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. You learn about natural law in classical philosophy. You also learn why modern, quote-unquote, scientific objections to classical Aristotelian philosophy fall short, even when they claim to have destroyed Aristotle and his thinking. I recommend all of these books because so much, gang, anymore, and I've talked about this before, we've discussed this before, so much now today, the problems that we face, they are not so much political problems, but they are cultural problems and they are philosophical problems. And so in order to actually understand, for example, why the transgender ideology is wrong, besides just the surface level objection, well, that biological men could use the bathroom, with our daughters, which would be reason enough. But to actually dive down deeper into the philosophical metaphysics of it, then you need to know something about formal causality, efficient causality, and final causality, right? Why, for example, you want to know why so many times that the left advocates for justice. Why do those arguments fail when you actually set them down, dissect them, and question the living hell out of them? Well, you need to know something about what justice actually is. What is its essence? What makes justice what it is? That's why I recommend Adler and I recommend Fazer. You'll get a lot of that in their books. I would also recommend The History of Philosophy by a man named Frederick Copleston, who was a certifiable genius. What Copleston did is nothing short of amazing. From the pre-Socratic, so going all the way to the beginning of philosophy, to, for him, the present, okay, he ends with a French philosopher named Sartre. He takes each major philosopher in Western civilization with some detours for Arabic / Muslim and Jewish philosophers, and he gives a biography about them, and then he also condenses their entire philosophy. It's a little bit more technical than Adler or even Fazer, but if you want to know, again, if you really want to see how ideas have matured, they have changed, how they have been mutated according to time, and how entire schools of philosophy have even changed. Idealism from Descartes to Berkeley, for example, this source is absolutely indispensable. You can get it in many different forms in individual books. What I did is I got the 3-volume compendium of it that was printed in 1985. Got this off of Amazon. This is volume 3, where they basically just compacted his entire history of philosophy into 3 volumes. Highly recommended. And before we leave Education Gang, I just have to give a brief shout out to Intercollegiate Studies Institute. If you go to their website, again, link is in the description, you will be able to find a student's guide to natural sciences, a student's guide to economics, a student's guide to many, many different topics. These give just a brief introduction to the different fields of study that they proclaim on their titles. The best thing about these books, gang, they are easily accessible, easily understandable, informative as all get out, and they are very economical. Each one, I believe, costs $3.95. Can't go wrong there. I also have one more thing to say about education before we move on, gang. Mea culpa, because I know that you're getting sick and tired of me talking about this. But our education cannot simply remain glued to books, as surprising as that might seem, because I have just been gabbing for who knows how many minutes dealing with books. I love books. A large part of my life revolves around books. You've seen how excited I've been getting just talking about these books. But the thing is, our salvation isn't going to come entirely from books. I have a theory, and it really deserves to be put into its own video so I could give it as much justice as my limited abilities can do it. But I'll give you a sneak peek at it, gang. I believe that civilizations only have a chance of thriving and can only survive if they remain rooted in reality. A large part of our problem today is that we have become unmoored from reality, from actually what is. And I'm not just talking about the transgender ideology and the ever-growing, blossoming mushroom cloud of gender identities. This goes for everyone across the board, even for myself. And the reason being is because we are cocooned, to a large extent, from what we would usually term, what our ancestors would have termed physical labor. We don't have to sweat. We don't have to bleed. We don't have to work physically, at least, for our daily bread. Now, in some cases, in some circumstances, that's really, really good. But it has a downside as well. It's a double-edged sword, like most things are. The downside, gang, is that so many of us, myself included, I see this in my own life, so I'm not, I am not Moses preaching to contrite sinners or anything like that. I am as guilty as anyone else. But we've gotten into this pattern, gang, where we get up, we'll go to work, we'll sit down at a computer console for 8-9 hours, we'll go to work, we'll come home, that is, and then we'll eat dinner, and then we'll sit in front of the TV and watch Fox News or Netflix until it's time to go to bed. And that's not what man was supposed to live. That's not how man was supposed to live. We've forgotten how to work with these. We can no longer really bale hay, build a stone wall. We can't chop our own firewood in a large extent. We've forgotten that we are bodies as well as minds. And that is something that we have to bring back as well. We have to remind ourselves of that. And I know that that's going to be challenging even for people who live in rural areas. And for people who live in urban areas, it's going to be even harder. I understand that. But there are, again, resources, again, that I will link down in the description box. Box gardens can be done in cities. There are even sites where they tell you how to keep bees in an urban setting. And even if it's something as mundane or seemingly simple as learning how to whittle just with a block of wood and a pocket knife, gang. And we take just a few minutes out of the day freeing an animal, a geometric shape, or maybe a face from a block of wood, like Michelangelo freed his David from the block of marble, then we're going to be taking the first vital step in actually reminding ourselves that, hey, we are a part of reality. We are rooted in the physical world, which we need in order to actually be full human beings. But, hate to be the bearer of bad news, gang, all the reinvigorated education in the world isn't going to mean diddly squat if we don't have people with us at our side while we're learning. First of all, because we need connections so that we can actually share what we're learning with other people. We can actually spread the message. But also, more fundamentally, because we need friends. We need friends because we were built for friendship, like Aristotle said. And I suppose on a more practical application, on a more practical level, no one of us can actually save the world on his own. So we actually need friends and allies. Now, social media has actually made us a little bit lazy on this because before in the past, this is primarily how we would make connections with new people. It was really easy and it was so versatile. You got on Facebook and 3 minutes later, you could be friends with someone who lived halfway around the world. Brilliant, amazing. However, recent events has shown that we can no longer trust or put any of our eggs in that basket. The Twitter purge of January, as well as Facebook just up and deciding to ban certain hashtags that it didn't like hashtag Stop the Steal, showed that the usual big tech mega corporations are implacably our enemies as of this moment going forward. And what's even worse, we can't even get onto another social media platform and create another account and make connections that way. Again, in January, we saw what happened on Parler, which was supposed to be the free speech alternative to Twitter. Google, Apple, Amazon all dropped it, meaning effectively Parler was dead. And it stayed dead unless they begged and groveled and pleaded that they would actually police speech on its platform. So the long and the short of it, gang, is that we actually have to go old school on this. We can't rely on social media, so we have to think outside of the social media box. One way that we could do that is that we could actually start sharing emails with the friends and allies that we have on social media, Twitter, Facebook, what have you. It's not a foolproof plan, I know, because search engines, corporations like Google are just as evil as Facebook and Twitter. I mean, I think 2 years ago in 2019, I made a whole video about how a former Google employee, a whistleblower, went to Project Veritas and literally said that Google's ultimate plan is to control how we perceive reality. Which, I mean, it is fully capable of doing, seeing that it owns 87% of the search engine market. And search engines are now the fast way that most people get their information or even do research. How we actually learn what's going on in the wider world. So Google is in a perfect position to actually do that. However, it is a little better. Email is a little better than social media because it is a bit more private. And because it actually allows you to write out an argument, I think, to actually share ideas. You're not constrained by a character limit on an email. You can actually read the email, read it again, think about it for a day, write a response, and send it to another person. And you can actually have a communication that way. You're not just having little snippets of a conversation, you are actually having a conversation. Another idea is to actually go a step further back than that and go back to the snail mail. Now, Again, I know the United States Postal Office is a $14 billion in the hole embarrassment. I wouldn't trust it with my dog, to be perfectly honest, but it does have to be said, at least for the time being, that more often than not, it does get the mail delivered. So again, it's more private than email. We haven't reached the point yet, at least, where government officials are actually reading our mail when we send it. Again, not yet. And you can, again, you're not constrained by a character limit. You can sit down, physically write out a letter, put it in the mail, wait for a response. It worked. It really worked from the 17th century all the way through the 20th century. Because again, email didn't really become big, I don't think, until, what was it, the late 80s, the 90s, when it really went mainstream. So letters were the primary means of communication between parties for the vast, vast majority of human history. We could bring it back. We can bring a Renaissance back, gang. And then another way to make it even more personable, gang, we can just start talking. And I'm one to talk, I know, because I am not a people person at all. But it's getting to the point where all of us are going to have to keep our ears open and, based on what we hear, just start maybe taking gambles. Talking to people that we see in church, at our gym, if they're open, at our clubs. Again, like a H10, I think, Boy Scouts, if you're in the Boy Scouts, Knights of Columbus, Sons of the American Legion, what have you. Just start talking with people. Start discussing things. Shift the conversation into an area. Get to know people first, too. So then you can have these deeper conversations. It really is about sort of, I guess, making friendly connections with people. On that note, we could start hosting dinner parties from time to time, just for, not lavish things that would make Louis XIV or Versailles blush or green with envy, but just little affairs. Have 2 or 3 friends over, chat about what you've been learning, where it fits into the conversation, or what might even be better, if you have connections already, if you have friends already, you can start reading, you can start studying, and then once a week you could get together at the local coffee shop, or get a bagel together and just discuss what you've read. Maybe it's one of the books that I've suggested, and you've read a chapter in the past week, a chapter a week, and you get with your small group of friends, again, 2, 3, 4 friends, and you discuss it together. Or maybe you're going through one of those Hillsdale courses and you're doing the same thing. The long and the short of it is, gang, though, that we're going to have to start actually, I think, making connections. Not just forming connections, like through social media, but actually making intimate connections. Making an actual, this almost sounds way too romantic, but almost an actual underground, like in World War II. Again, that's way too romantic. That makes it sound way more dangerous and way more daring than it actually is, at least for right now, again, but sort of the equivalent. You didn't, during a war, even if they had text messages during World War II, they wouldn't just send out a group text to the resistance leaders and say, right, mates, we're going to meet over here. Usual spot, usual time at Charlie's, talk about how we're going to upset the Nazi plans again this week. No, they didn't do that. They would have actually known the people, or at least some of the people in the resistance, and they would have formed those connections, and they would have gone forward, proceeded forward like that. We're going to have to do the same thing, I think, again here. If we really want to start changing hearts and minds, have that opportunity to do so, that's what we're going to have to do. And the third thing, and I'm going to leave it right here again because I've been talking, I know, I'm sorry, for an abysmally long time. This might be actually a sort of record for the length of video that I've done. But this is actually the most important, gang. And it's also the most nebulous. And it's the one where I have the weakest idea of actually how to do it. So, of course, this would be the most important. But we have to start rekindling in ourselves a spirit of liberty, as the founders and the framers would have said. We have to have a passionate nature about this. I am fully convinced that social, cultural, political change, for the most part, it's not made by majority, silent or otherwise. It is actually made by dedicated, zealous minorities, people who believe down to the very core of their being that what they're doing is true and right, and which gives them the strength and the will to keep slogging through hell, even when it seems completely, absolutely hopeless. And that's actually the spirit that the founders and the revolutionaries had. I mean, when you think about it again, we have this very romanticized vision of the American Revolution, the first American Revolution, because we are the product of it. Of course, now we think the revolution had to succeed. There is an unmitigated, uninterrupted line from 1763 to 1789. Absolutely. But that's not what it was like for the people who actually fought, lived, and breathed the revolution. Remember, 13 disparate, disunified British colonies, which really had no history of cooperation. Total population of 3 million people, only about between 35 to 40% were actually for independence, went up against the premier superpower of the 18th century, with no money, no army, no navy, and no allies even. The odds were completely against the American Revolution. In fact, if you had been there in 1776, if you were a gambling man, you would have bet on the British. Simply because betting on the American, on the Continental Army, the Continental cause, the cause of independence, would have been a pipe dream. Of course they couldn't win. They shouldn't have won. And yet, gang, even though they shouldn't have won, they still fought. Because they had internalized the message that Winston Churchill would give in the 20th century that I've shared before. There are times when you have to fight, when there is small chance of success. And it might even be worse. You might have to fight when there is absolutely no chance of victory, because it is better to die free than to live as slaves. That's the sort of spirit that we need to build back up in ourselves. The left has it in spades. That's why the left, hate to say this, but this is why the left up to this point has been winning the culture war. Because they honestly believe in what they say, and they are willing to do whatever is necessary to actually win those cultural fights that they absolutely believe in. That is the steam that we need so that we can turn the tables on them and retake the culture. Now, I don't know how to do that, gang. I sincerely don't, because again, now we're talking about something nebulous like spirit. There is no scientific equation to say, oh, well, you just, do all of this and voila, you will have the spirit of liberty within you again. What I do personally, I unplug myself from everything. I leave the phone at home. I have no electronics on me. I take my dog, Toby, for a walk, and I just sort of, I guess maybe the right word is daydream. I think about what our ancestors did in the past, what the first Americans did. The Puritans coming here, clinging to a way of life and a civilization, even though it would have been far easier just to stay in England. The people who fomented the revolution, the people who maintained that revolution, the people who fought in the Civil War, the people who rebuilt the nation, imperfect as it was after that, the people who fought, bled, and died in the First and the Second World Wars, the people who continued working, scraping a living through the Great Depression. I think about all of that, And I think, yeah, we've got long odds, and the situation isn't exactly the same one for one, but they had long odds too, and they didn't give up. And then two things happened. I'm just being honest here, gang. Speaking just kind of from the heart. I think, first of all, if they didn't give up, then I damn well have no right to give up either. And then I think I can't give up. Because at that point, I'm mad. I think about what these pipsqueak ideologues are doing to our country and our nation, our culture, our history, our heritage. All the things that the millions and millions of people who came before us preserved through their work, through their lives, and then died for. Whether they died in war or they just keeled over one day and died like we all will. They did their part, however small, however minuscule, to preserve this home that we have. They did it so that they could hand it down to their children, and then to their grandchildren, then to their great-grandchildren, and eventually it was passed down to us. And I'm not going to let that go without a fight. There's just no question about that. Gang, I have been talking for way, way too long. So again, explore the resources that are listed down below. Think about what I've said. Do not feel overwhelmed. My goal here is not for anybody to feel overwhelmed. I know that I have thrown pretty much everything and the kitchen sink at you in this video. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't. All we need to do is start taking baby steps. I think it was Lao Tzu, the Chinese teacher who wrote the Tao Te Ching. He started Taoism. And there is a saying attributed to Lao Tzu: the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And that is true. It was true back then in his day, and that's true again today. All we need to start doing, gang, is take the first baby steps. And then things will add up from there. Stay safe, stay free, gang, by daring to read, think, speak, and write. If you got any other ideas and opinions, let me know in the comment section. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, gang. I will talk to you later. Ciao.